to the Injured List podcast, your source for all sports injury topics. For the weekend warrior to the sports fantasy guru, we keep you in the action and out of the injured list.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the host of the Injured List podcast, Brian Scott.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Injured List. I'm your host, Brian Scott, and no, I know what you're thinking. I am not Irish, even though St. Paddy's Day is right around the corner. In fact, it's today, March 17th, 2021. I hope you are all celebrating at some point in time throughout the day here, drinking your green beer, wearing your green-colored garb. But I'm actually 100% Italian. And where my parents got the name Brian Scott from, I couldn't tell you. But we've got documents backing it up. We're from Italy originally, came over to the United States, and, well, the rest is history, I guess. But I am not Irish. But you know what? On St. Paddy's Day, everybody's Irish. So I encourage you to celebrate and enjoy the day with your friends and your family. As we wind down from COVID, people are getting vaccinated, kids are going back to school. It's starting to actually look like it's getting back to normal. I couldn't be more excited. I hope you are too. And thanks for joining us. We're going to take a quick word from our sponsors. And when we get back, we are going to go through some sports medicine terminology. And we're going to kind of dispel some of the common misconceptions and myths regarding some of the words that we're going to talk about and some of the injuries that we've discussed on the previous episodes. So sit tight. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Hey, this is Sean Colas with the Percentile and Creamery. We are the premier coffee, ice cream, and dessert bar in the Charlotte metro area. We're thrilling people with our amazing interior design, our incredible customer service, and the quality of our offerings. We have a beautifully designed 1920s mercantile-themed monochromatic throwback where people feel excited by their surroundings and blown away by their treats. We're great for business meetings, families, couples, and you. Ask about our room rentals for meetings, events, or parties. We're nestled next to the Concord Mills Mall, behind Verizon, and in the same building as McAllister's in Concord, North Carolina. Hey, if you're in the area and you're listening to this right now, get in your car, drive over to the Percentile, mention that you heard us on Brian Scott's amazing Injured List Podcast 2020, and receive 25% off your purchase.
Hey guys, are you looking to avoid injury when it comes to your finances? Talk to a professional who can help, whether you are looking to get your financial house in order or simply looking for that second opinion. Visit TrustTreeFinancial.com and schedule your free virtual consultation. Once again, that's TrustTreeFinancial.com.
The Injured List podcast is proudly sponsored by TransitioningVeteran.com. Founded in 2008 by a former enlisted armed service member, Transitioning Veteran provides free information and resources to help guide past, future, and present service members through the transition process from active service to civilian life. This free website provides links, articles, and general information about the services available to members of the armed forces and their dependents. It can be a daunting task searching for pertinent information in today's technological age. TransitioningVeteran.com hopes to provide a centralized location for the many resources that are available to military veterans. From education benefits, employment opportunities, to medical benefits for both military members and their families, make TransitioningVeteran.com your go-to resource. On behalf of the Injured List podcast, we thank you for your service. And through our partnership with TransitioningVeteran.com, we hope to give back to the military community. Hey everybody, welcome back. Your host Brian Scott here with you once again, and today we're going to talk about some sports medicine terminology and going to kind of simplify everything for you guys, dispel some common misconceptions and myths about some of the topics we discussed in the past. So let's get started. And I'm just going to go through this real quick because, well, let's face it, you've heard it all before if you've listened to previous episodes. So I don't want to bore you with the same old dribble. But you may have heard some terms thrown around, and maybe you still don't have a good grasp or understanding of what we're talking about. So I want to go through it and just kind of make it simplified for you so that you can understand it a little better. And that way, when you hear it going forward in some future episodes, you won't be so lost if you were the first time around. So we're going to start at the head. We're going to kind of work our way down. Now, you may hear us talk a lot about head injuries and in particular, concussions. Now, it's been a big thing in the recent years. When I was an athletic trainer back in the early 2000s, it was really starting to come on board as to the seriousness of concussions and the long-term effects. Now, fast forward about 20 years later, and now you hear terms like CTE, which stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which has been linked to a lot of former NFL players who've committed suicide or had some type of psychosocial or mental issues as they've gotten past their careers, or even some guys like Aaron Hernandez, who may have been dealing with this during their playing careers. So there's a lot of stuff, a lot of research, a lot of literature out there examining concussions and its effect on the psyche of players, both past and present. And it's an ongoing and developing thing. CTE is still fairly new. There's a lot of research out there being done because there's a lot of things they don't know about it. Now, when you hear the word concussion, people now are automatically assuming that we are talking about CTE. But that's not necessarily the case. CTE is a result of many traumatic type of concussions. It's a accumulation of concussions over a course of time. It's not necessarily describing one concussion or one event that leads to a concussion. It's the culmination of many different episodes of concussive injuries. So a lot of people confuse those two terminologies and assimilate them as one. A concussion is a specific event that leads to an injury of the brain. And a concussion, it's basically some type of force that causes the brain to shift within the cranium, which concusses it or injures it to some degree. And that can be something as simple and mild as, quote unquote, having your bell rung, or, being in a quote unquote daze, or, getting smacked around, quote unquote. There's a lot of different slang terms that athletes and fans will use to kind of describe injuries that are sort of the type of mechanism associated with concussions, but they're all the same. It's all involves some type of head trauma that causes the brain to some degree shift within the skull, causing some degree of injury. It could be something as simple as just having a simple headache, or it could be something as serious as prolonged period of loss of consciousness with disorientation and some type of retrograde amnesia where you basically forget the events leading up to that. There could be some antegrade amnesia or some retrograde amnesia where you lose some memory following the event. So there's a very large array of severity associated with concussive type injuries, and it's a topic that one day I hope to get into in more detail, but it's a big topic, and it's not something that I typically deal with now. There's a lot of specialists who focus primarily on sports-related concussions, and I'm going to leave it to them. But if you guys have questions about it, I'll be happy to answer as much as I can. Just remember going forward, when I talk about these terms, unless I'm specifically mentioning CTE, I'm really just talking about concussions. They are separate thing. All right, we're going to keep moving down. We're going to go to the shoulder. And the shoulder is one of those joints that has a tremendous amount of motion. As a result, there's a fine balance between motion and stability. People can have very unstable shoulders, which can predispose them to injuries such as dislocations. Dislocation is a term to describe the actual dislocation of a joint, where the joint actually pops out of place. In the shoulder, it's a matter of the shoulder popping out of the shoulder socket. The hip is also a ball and socket joint. These are very commonly associated with injuries in football because of the nature of the sport, where there's a lot of tackling and hitting. Although these type of injuries can happen in any sport, Bo Jackson being probably the most famous type of hip dislocation, which also led to a fracture. Tua Tagovailoa recently sustained a hip dislocation. So it does happen. It's not very common. It's a high type of traumatic injury. Now, shoulder dislocations, conversely, don't always take a lot of trauma. Sometimes they can even happen with no direct trauma at all. Michael Conforto of the New York Mets actually dislocated his shoulder joint when he was swinging a baseball bat and he missed and swung at a strike. So if there is any type of predisposing instability in the shoulder joint, it can make it prone to dislocating. When we're talking about the shoulder joint and we talk about dislocation, we're typically talking about the glenohumeral joint. This is the joint where the upper part of your arm, your humerus, attaches to the shoulder girdle, your scapula. It's where the motion of throwing overhand occurs. It's where the motion of tennis serving occurs. It's where the motions associated with the overhand or breaststroke in swimming or the freestyle stroke. So it's an important joint in athletics, especially any of the athletics that involves upper extremity movements. There is a tremendous amount of velocity that can be generated in this joint. Sometimes it comes at the sacrifice of stability. And so it's a fine balance between the two. But it can also, in athletes like Noah Syndergaard and DeGrom, these guys can throw a baseball at super high velocity, and their arms are traveling sometimes in thousands of degrees per second, able to make that happen. So it's amazing amount of force that can be generated at the shoulder joint, which is not one of the strongest joints in the body, but it is somewhat susceptible to injury. Some other injuries in the shoulder that are very common, especially with football, is you'll see or hear about a shoulder separation. This is not the same as a dislocation, and that's very commonly confused. Separation typically occurs at the AC joint, or where the clavicle, your collarbone, attaches to the acromion, which is a portion of the shoulder scapula. And this is another joint that kind of makes up the shoulder girdle. This is typically more associated with a direct contact type injury. So someone going to make a tackle, they hit them using their shoulder to kind of lean into the hit. And basically what this is a ligament injury, where the ligament gets disrupted that holds these bones together, and you end up developing a bump or a raised clavicle, which looks like a bump on the outside. And that's basically a shoulder separation. And you hear about that all the time. Another term to refer to this is what's called an AC joint sprain. The AC sprain is the acromioclavicular joint. It's where the acromion and the clavicle meet up. So it's that articulation where the separation occurs, and that's usually injury to ligaments. So when you hear sprain, think ligaments. When you hear dislocation, think ligaments, think shoulder joint, glenohumeral joint, think it's not a sprain because the joint has actually popped out of the joint, and so the ligaments are either torn, most of the time they're torn, or severely stretched. Sprain is injury to the ligaments to some degree, but the joint doesn't necessarily have to be dislocated for that to happen. So a little bit of a kind of muttering of the terms and stuff, but that's basically the gist of it. Now, another big shoulder injury or terminologies that you might hear are the rotator cuff, and you hear this a lot with baseball pitching. You hear about labrums. You hear about guys who have to have shoulder surgery in baseball, and this is typically related to either the labrum or the rotator cuff. The rotator cuff is just a group of muscles that basically form a cuff around the upper part of your arm where it articulates with the glenohumeral joint or the shoulder. And this is where these muscles are really important for throwing because these are the muscles responsible for it. They help rotate the arm. They help slow the arm down after you release the ball. And so these muscles are not very big, but they are actually quite strong. But they're also very prone to injury with repetitive type of high velocity movements like baseball throwing. Now, the labrum is the ring of cartilage that sits inside the socket of your shoulder, and that's responsible for providing some stability of your shoulder joint as it moves within the socket. So this is also susceptible to tearing with high speed or high velocity movements like baseball pitching, but it's also can be injured with dislocation of the shoulder. So these things are all kind of interconnected to some degree. A lot of times you might hear the terms getting thrown around together, but they are often talking about very specific or very different injuries. So don't confuse them, and if you have questions, just ask. Moving on down, we're talking about elbow. One of the big elbow injuries or the big elbow stories you hear a lot about in the press today is Tommy John surgery. This is a surgery that involves reconstructing ligaments in the elbow, most specifically, or more specifically, the ulnar collateral ligament, which is the ligament on the inside portion of your elbow. So if you're looking at your elbow with your palm up, it's going to be the ligaments that are on the inside part of your elbow, closest to your torso. And This ligament has 3 bands that help make it up, and it's really important for stability of the elbow joint as you're throwing a baseball. And as you're accelerating the arm forward to release the pitch, there's a tremendous amount of force being applied at this particular joint and on this particular ligament. And so injury to this ligament over time and repetitive type of high velocity movements like baseball pitches cause this ligament to basically tear to some degree and or possibly fail or rupture. And so the Tommy John surgery basically reconstructs that. And it's a very common to hear that so-and-so has a baseball injury and they're going for Tommy John surgery. And when you hear that, that's the ligament that they're going to reconstruct. And it takes a long time for these ligaments to heal because they're usually reconstructing them with something else, not the native ligament, because that is usually torn to a degree where it cannot be repaired. It has to be replaced. And when they replace it, they usually use some type of graft, whether it be a tendon from a cadaver, somebody who donated their tissue for medical use, or some type of synthetic, which is not very common these days, but back in the day it was. So that's why it takes so long for them to recover from this, and it takes so long for pitchers to get back in the mound and start throwing. It's a very long recovery period. The body has to basically accept the new reconstructed ligament and heal it into place before you can start really stressing it. Now, a lot of times you'll hear the hand with injuries, especially in boxing or MMA, where guys are doing a lot of punching. You'll also see a lot of baseball batters who get hit by pitches sustain some injuries to the hand as well. Drew Brees had injuries to his thumb a couple of years ago, had to have surgery. I think he might have actually even did it this past season. You hear about that a lot with quarterbacks in the NFL. A lot of times they'll throw a ball. As they're following through, they'll hit somebody's helmet and they'll injure their thumb. Don't forget, you have a lot of joints in your hand where all your fingers bend. You have a lot of tendons to help move the muscles that move your hand. You have a lot of ligaments between the bones that help stabilize the bones of the hand. And so there's a lot of different injuries that can occur in the hand, to the fingers, to the bones in the hand, to the wrist, and it's all kind of interconnected. You don't hear too much about those because a lot of times guys can kind of play through it depending on their position and depending on the sport. And a lot of those injuries don't necessarily require surgery, although Drew Brees was one example who did have some reconstructive surgery of the thumb, and that was a ligament type of reconstruction for the thumb, similar to what we talked about with the elbow. When you start getting into these body parts, a lot of these sports injuries in particular, you start seeing a lot of ligament type injuries, and that's probably the most common. Now, as we move down to the lower extremity and we cross the pelvis, we talk a little bit about the hip. Some of the big injuries that you've seen over the years related to Bo Jackson and to a Tonga Viola, like I mentioned earlier, are usually hip type of injuries where you have hip fractures or hip dislocations. Those are not actually very common. What is more common, though, is hip labrum injuries where, similar to the shoulder, your hip joint has a labrum. And that structure deepens the socket, provides stability, but it can also get torn, similar to like the labrum in your shoulder. And so hockey players actually sustain this one a lot. And oftentimes that can be surgically repaired. Again, very technically challenging surgery, and it takes a long time to recover, so they usually miss quite a bit of action, extended period of time to help recover, get back on the ice. You also see it a lot with soccer players. I would say those are probably the two big athletes that usually undergo hip labrum repairs or surgeries. And again, the labrum is a piece of tissue that's different from cartilage. It's similar to cartilage in the sense that that's really what it is, but it's not a ligament. It's not a tendon. It's labrum. It's basically a cartilaginous ring that deepens a joint or provides stability to a joint. As we make our way down to the knee, this one is always reported in the news, and you hear a lot about it. Let's be honest. Humans are bipedal. We walk on 2 feet, but the knees are not really well designed to do some of the things that we do, yet we're able to do it because our bodies adapt. Well, when the knee sustains injuries to some of the major ligaments, you're just not going to be able to adapt. And the only way to really get you back on the playing field usually requires some type of reconstructive surgery. The more common reconstructive surgical ligaments in the knee are the ACL, and it stands for anterior cruciate ligament. It's the front part of the knee where ligaments cross. But keep in mind, this is deep inside the knee joint. This is not a superficial ligament. You can't feel it. You can't see it. It's inside the knee. and it's one of the primary stabilizers of stability in the knee joint. So it's vital to stability of your knee, which is basically just a hinge. And if you don't have these ligaments functioning properly, if they're injured, your knee will be unstable, it'll buckle, give out on you. And when that happens, you're risking damage to the cartilage of the joint, which is the thing that helps the joint glide nice and smooth and allows you to move the knee without pain, run and jump, and do all the things you need to do in your athletic venue. So it's vital that your primary stabilizers, like your collateral ligaments and your cruciate ligaments of the knee, are healthy and not injured if you're going to be out there playing sport. Some other injuries in the past to the knee that you may recall, and I'm just going off the cuff here, off the top of my head. Victor Cruz with the New York Giants years ago sustained a patellar tendon fracture and rupture. It caused him to miss like 2 years. He was never quite the same after he came back. And this is a tendon injury where the tendon that attaches to the front part of your shin kind of runs up and blends into your kneecap and then blends into the quadricep muscle, which is a big muscle that you see with the teardrop on the front part of your thigh. And so this tendon is really important to provide function for your knee, so you can straighten it, extend it, explosive movements like jumping, running, changing direction, things like that. Jeremy Lin also had an injury to his patellar tendon a few years ago, had to have it surgically repaired. He missed a lot of time from that, and it pretty much kind of put a dent in his NBA career. I think shortly after that, he ended up playing for a little bit in China. He's kind of making his way back to the NBA here. He's in the G League currently, but that's a tough one to bounce back from, no pun intended, especially if you're in basketball where you're doing a lot of running and jumping, because that tendon is really important for that. It's vital to be healthy in order to be able to run and jump and make explosive type movements in basketballs. As we come further down, we get to the foot and ankle. We've talked a lot about this in the past. If you remember, I did a whole episode on Alex Smith's injury. ESPN did a beautiful documentary about his recovery from his surgery and his near fatal infection, which caused sepsis. Well, it's a pretty complex joint, the ankle, and the foot. You got to kind of lump them together. There's a lot of interconnecting parts. There's a lot of joints. There's a lot of ligaments, tendons, and muscles that act on it. And it's very commonly injured in sport, and all sports across the board, to be honest. And the reason for that is obvious. I mean, we participate on our feet, and a lot of the sports we do involve a lot of running, jumping, cutting, and changing direction. And all of those things can lead to ankle injuries. Ankle injuries can be as simple as just a sprain, which again involves ligaments being either torn or stretched to some degree, or fractures, or broken bones, which is the same thing. You hear the term fractures, it's the same as a broken bone. And this can occur in many different bones in the ankle and foot, each of varying degrees of severity and complexity, and require varying degrees of treatment, surgery, and or rehabilitation. So it can get very complex. There's a lot of little nuances to it, and not just the ankle, but all the joints and all the muscles and all the stuff across the body when it comes to sports injuries. I'm just giving you a broad overview of some of the terminology and some of the things we talked about before. So if you guys are interested in learning more, or you want to know about a specific sports injury that you heard about, or maybe you read about, just hit me up. Shoot me an email. Check out my website, www.theinjuredlist.com. You can reach out to me there. You can sign up, ask questions on a post or a thread. You can just check out my past episodes on Spotify, Apple, iTunes, you name it. I'm on all the major podcast platforms, and I implore you to check out some previous episodes where I give a little bit more detail on some of the more common sports injuries that we've encountered throughout the last year here. And I look forward to bringing you more information, and I look forward to getting a lot more interviews. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed some of the terminology. I know I went fast, but just kind of keep it brief and keep you interested and not take up too much of your time because, I'm a full-time employee and I've got a life and with family and kids. And I usually end up doing this on a late night from my office while the kids are sleeping. So I know how life goes. Anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned. We'll be back soon with some more episodes and more information. And don't forget, check me out every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. or every other Tuesday night now at 8 p.m. on the Devil's Advocate Sports Talk live on Facebook with my good friend and host, Abe Delgado. As always, guys, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay active.
You're listening to the Injured List Podcast with your host, Brian Scott, your go-to resource for all sport injury-related topics. For show notes and other resources, visit theinjuredlist.com.